Hi everyone, and welcome to another session of Otis for Educators. My name is Emma Foley, and I'm a curriculum specialist here at Tech. Today you're joining us for a special course on creating e-portfolios using Google Sites. I also have Kaylee here to help out in the chat box. How you doing today, Kaylee?
Hey Emma, hey everyone. Again, my name is Kaylee. I'm also a curriculum specialist here at Tech. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them here in the chat box and I will get those answered for you.
Great, thanks Kaylee. Let's take a look at our agenda and get started. So taking a look at our agenda here, the first thing we're going to go over is I created a little bit of a roadmap just to show the progression of this course, as we're going to focus on how you can build e-portfolios for your students, specifically using Google Sites. Then we're going to go over the 4-stage process. So I've kind of chunked everything that you need to know about creating e-portfolios and introducing the idea to students into 4 stages as you see here. So we're going to take a look at each one of those a little closer and get an idea of what exactly you need to do as the teacher to prepare your students for this. Next, we'll go over some Google Sites features. So since we are using Google Sites to create our e-portfolios, you definitely want to make sure that your students are familiar. So we'll talk about all those features that are going to be used in that e-portfolio creation. Next, we'll take a look at a sample e-portfolio that I have created and some of those interactive components on it. And then finally, I'll share with you some additional Otis content here on our platform that you can check out, as well as some links that I've included below this video on the Files and Links tab. So now taking a look at our roadmap. So as you can see here, this is kind of the way that we're going to progress through this course and get you familiar with creating e-portfolios on Google Sites. So we'll take a look at those 4 stages and look at those a little bit closer just so you get an idea of exactly what the process entails. Then we'll take a look at the Google Sites features, so I'll hop on over to the computer and show you all those different spots that you want to make sure students are familiar with when you set them off to start creating their e-portfolio. And then finally, we'll take a look at that finished product for the elementary level. So as you can see here, we got a lot to cover, but hopefully by the end of this course, you feel a little more comfortable with Google Sites and creating those online portfolios. So now moving along in our agenda, now we're going to dive into that 4-stage process. So as you can see from our graphic here, we're going to go over each one of those steps separately just so you can get a better idea of what exactly you need to do as the teacher and how you're going to involve your students in this process. So the first step is the e-portfolio introduction. So it's really important that you explain the purpose and the components to your students. So students are going to be part of this process. They're going to be creating things that they're going to add to their e-portfolio. And depending on the age of your students, you might even consider having students select those artifacts or those work samples that are going to be a part of their portfolio. So in order to do that, you have to start by explaining some of the different components and what the purpose of this is. So there's a lot of different purposes that we're going to go over on the next slide, because portfolios may serve a different purpose depending on your grade level or what you're exactly trying to show with this online showcase. The next stage is going to be that digitization. So that's making all of those different work samples digital, because again, we're using Google Sites, so we want to make sure that we have those samples ready to go to include into our Google Sites. So that might mean something like having students transfer their work from a paper copy to a Google Doc or some other Word document. Or this might simply mean taking a picture of their work and storing it somewhere on their device, so when they're ready to transfer over all that work to the Google site, it's there and ready to go in digital form. The next step is going to be building. So you're going to show students how they can create this bulk folder or this space, this home, for all of these digital documents to live. You don't want students to be scrambling, or if you're the one assembling the ePortfolio, you don't want to be scrambling at the end to find these different documents for each student that you're creating the portfolio for. Having this central place, this bulk folder, somewhere, either whether it lives on Google Drive or even just a folder for each student on your device, you definitely want to have a storage place that's going to allow you to collect all of those samples so they're ready to go when you get to the final part. So the final part is going to be creating the showcase. So actually assembling that ePortfolio. So that's going to include embedding some of the files, maybe adding some images, or since we're talking about making interactive portfolios, this might be adding a video component. So all of these different things are going to allow you to make a really customized, unique portfolio for each student that you are creating them for. So now we're going to take a closer look at each one of these stages. So I mentioned that the first stage is that ePortfolio purpose. So as you can see from our graphic here, there might be a few different ways that you are using a portfolio in your classroom. So the first reason might be because you want to further student understanding. You want to deepen their topic knowledge. The next reason that you might be creating an ePortfolio might be to assess student understanding. So you really want to make sure, did my students in the beginning of the year, this is their understanding of this topic, and here is a work sample to show that they really have shown some growth. Their understanding of this topic has now grown to this point. The third thing here I mentioned is showcasing student learning or showing that growth. So again, there are multiple purposes, but you're going to notice that regardless of whichever purpose you choose here for your ePortfolio, you're still going to be able to use Google Sites. You're going to follow those same basic steps like collecting all of the work samples, making them into digital copies, and then gathering them all in a central place either on your device or on Google Drive. Now, this is a really big piece as you see here. So here I've just compiled some different things that you want to think about when you're having that introductory conversation with students. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really important that you explain the purpose of the ePortfolio with your students. If students are going to have a hand in creating this ePortfolio, selecting which of their work samples they want to include, you want to make sure you go over some different things. So as I mentioned, you want to make sure you go over that intended purpose. So what exactly are you showing through the ePortfolio? You want to decide, is this going to be something that's cross-curricular, or is this something that's going to be subject-specific? So is this going to be only a math or ePortfolio? So this might be more applicable if we're thinking about creating portfolios for the upper grade levels like middle school or high school, where students might be creating multiple ePortfolios for each of the different content areas. If you're an elementary school teacher, you might be creating an ePortfolio to show how the students have shown growth across all subject areas. So definitely going to look a little bit different depending on the age range, as well as whether you're content specific or cross-curricular. The next thing I mentioned here is suggested title list or student choice. So are you going to really make it so that every student has the same sections on their ePortfolio? Are you going to make it so that every portfolio follows a naming convention? You really want to make these decisions beforehand. You also want to make that decision whether you're going to allow students to be a little more selective in this process. Are they able to choose the title for their portfolio? Are they going to customize each of those pages or sections on their Google site with unique names? So definitely something you want to consider. Once again, this might be a conversation that you have with your younger students, telling them this is what we're going to do. And then those older students, you might invite them to be part of that decision-making process. The last thing I mentioned here, as I already said, is required pages. So if you're going to require that students have certain pages on their ePortfolio, now might be a time where you give those specific page names that you want them to have. You might even choose to do this in the form of a rubric. So show them exactly how their ePortfolio is going to be quote unquote graded. It might not be graded if it's just something to show student growth, but a rubric is a great way to show the different components in this big cumulative project. So now moving along, the next part is kind of this special component that I think is really valuable. And this is something that you're going to want to explicitly teach students, especially if they haven't had the opportunity to do this before. So in the e-portfolios, you want to consider adding something called a learning journal. Basically, what a learning journal is it's used to help students make reflections about their experience. So when we take a look at the example a little later on, you're going to notice that I'm not only going to collect student work, but you're going to see those student reflections alongside those work samples. So it's a great way for students to be able to recognize some of the patterns and themes in their work and how they've evolved from either the beginning of the year to the end of the year, or whatever time frame you're looking at, first quarter to second quarter, first quarter to the end of the year. Where can a learning journal live? So one suggestion, since we're talking about the Google applications, one suggestion is to have students start doing those reflections on a Google Doc, and then when they get to that final stage of assembling their e-portfolio, transferring it over to the Google site. This way everything is kind of in one place, and then it's a one-time shot transfer over to the Google site as they begin, or you begin, to assemble their e-portfolio. And finally, student choice. So here are some opportunities depending on your group of students. You know them best. But do you want to have a certain wording that students need to use for their reflections? Is there going to be a sentence frame that they're going to all start off with? You know, do you want it to be super cookie cutter, or do you want to have it where students have a lot of freedom and choice in their wording? Also, you want to think about the different layout features for the learning journal. So when we take a look at Google Sites later on, you'll see that students can include their images in different ways along with that text. So maybe the image up on top and the text, the learning journal reflection, goes below it, or side by side. Lots of different options. Really great way to have students switch up their layouts and make every e-portfolio a little bit different. And also, as you know, there are those different font options on Google Sites. So lots of great things here to really make each e-portfolio individualized and not make it this one-size-fits-all type idea. So now moving along, now we're going to talk a little bit about that, making your documents and your artifacts digital. So what does this exactly mean? Some things you might want to consider when you're moving all of that student work, if it is on a paper copy, into that digital component. You want to make sure that you specify with students whether they're going to be requiring images, video, or is there going to be both reflected on their e-portfolio. So a couple of different options there, again, to make it unique depending on the student and really tap into those different learning styles. Also, just a reminder here, make sure that if students are going to be adding a video component to their e-portfolio, if you need parent consent, I would definitely suggest you do that at the start of this e-portfolio creation, especially if student faces are going to be shown on the internet, if you're publishing this e-portfolio to be accessible by people even outside of maybe the close-knit school community. Also, you might want to think about implementing some sort of buddy system. And I mentioned here to relieve burden. So Google Sites can be a very robust application. And if students are not too familiar with creating an e-portfolio or creating any sort of Google site, they might not be as comfortable. And you might find that there are a lot of questions every time they get to something. You know, how do I include an image? How do I do this? How do I do this? So definitely leverage those really experienced students in your class to help out those other struggling students as they begin to assemble, especially that learning journal component. Also think about the access to hardware. So are students going to all be able to assemble their e-portfolio at the same time? If you don't have one-to-one devices, you might want to set up a schedule where students are going to get access to the laptops, be able to assemble all of those different things, or even create those folders on Google Drive for that, housing all those documents. You definitely want to make sure that all students have equal access to creating this e-portfolio. So now moving along, we're going to talk a little bit about that building phase. So here I've kind of broken it up into 3 key points. The first one being to set up a designated place. So as I mentioned earlier, you definitely want to really encourage students to stay organized when they're creating their ePortfolio. It can get really overwhelming when there's a lot of different documents, and even if students aren't going to use them on their final ePortfolio, you want to make sure that they have them there and they're ready if they do choose to use them. So one place we suggest that you create this central hub for all the digital documents would be Google Drive. And the reason for that is because you have that opportunity to upload many different file types into Google Drive. So that includes your Google Docs, your Google Drawings, slides presentations, PDFs, images, and even Office 365 documents can be really easily converted to a way that they're easy to upload right onto the Google site. So really versatile program for that central hub for all of the artifacts students might be including. I also mentioned here, you definitely want to make sure you set aside some time for modeling. So this might, depending on the age of your students, this might be a whole class activity that you want to make sure that you do with students. So you want to make sure that you model to them how to stay organized, how to create a folder, how to create subfolders, all to really streamline that process and make sure that students, when they need those artifacts, they know where they are and they're ready to go. And now we're going to move into some last things here in terms of those artifacts. So when students are selecting the artifacts, you definitely want to consider, which artifacts are you going to require that they have? Is it going to be a more general list, like have one writing sample, one reading benchmark assessment, have one math assessment, one problem-solving activity, one political cartoon, or are you going to make it a little more specific? You need a writing sample from October, you need a writing sample from December, and a writing sample from April. Do you want students to have a little more choice in what they include, or do you want it to be a little more specific? And this is entirely up to you and what purpose you want this ePortfolio to serve. Also mention here, make sure students understand the different types of assessment. So you're definitely looking for something that's going to showcase their growth. So if it's something that was more of an informal type of assessment, maybe you gave them this reading activity or writing activity to do, and students really didn't devote as their best attention to it or their best work, you might not want to encourage students to use that informative assessment in their portfolio. So definitely some things to consider in terms of what is included and that selection process. And finally, we're going to move now into some general guidelines for creating that showcase. So it's been a lot of talking here, but I really think this is important because it will help you understand exactly what goes into each part of this ePortfolio creation, and it will all make sense when we hop over to the computer in a few minutes and take a look at that sample. So here's the last part that I have here, and this is going to include those revisiting of skills. So as I mentioned, before students can actually say, this is my ePortfolio, this is how I'm showcasing all my work, you're going to want to make sure that they're going to have that background knowledge about how to assemble and navigate through Google Sites. If it's a mess of a Google site and it's not easily, no one can navigate through it very easily, and it seems like everything is kind of just thrown or embedded into the Google site and there's no real rhyme or reason to where things are, you're going to notice that the portfolio really doesn't serve its purpose. So you want to make sure that students are familiar with these different skills on Google Sites. So some things here, setting up and creating additional pages and subpages. We'll take a look at what that looks like in a little bit. Applying some of the templates or themes. So again, just another option for some student choice. We already mentioned adjusting those layouts. Expanding content by adding text and images. So this is going to directly relate to that learning journal component that's going to have not only the artifacts, but also some of those reflections. So students might choose to record their reflections in video format, or they might choose to embed the picture of their work and then some written reflections there. Embedding URLs, so this is going to go along with that interactive component, so including things like buttons. So students need to know how to embed that URL into the button format to then direct whoever's visiting their ePortfolio to another site. Embedding the files, so we already touched on this, that's our docs, our slides, our forms, all of those different great things that students have completed throughout the year. How can they go ahead and embed those? Adjusting the web address, so this is going to be that actual address bar for the Google site. So if you want to have, again, a naming convention, you might want to consider going over that process with students of how to adjust the web address. And finally, the last couple that we have here, sharing and adjusting editing rights. So this is really important. You want to make sure that whoever students are sharing their ePortfolio out with, that person not only has the option to access it, but also that they can view all of the pages and that it's actually accessible to them. So if they're accessing it on a tablet or a phone, you want to make sure that everything is viewable, nothing is overlapping, things like that. And finally, that last process, which is the publishing process. So this has been a lot of information, but again, I think it's really important that you take the time to explain all of these different phases that students are going to go through as they start building their ePortfolio, or even you be familiar with it yourself as you're assembling these ePortfolios.
And Emma, I did just want to add in here that these are great tips, and you definitely do want to go through all of these different steps with your students and model that for them. But another great thing that you can do is once you have a demo site, even the one that Emma's created right here, we can use as a sample, show that to your students so that they can actually see what a finished product looks like. There's so many Google sites out there, whether you create your own, use the example we have, and that's going to really allow your students to see that this is what it looks like when it's fully completed, and then they'll be a little bit more comfortable with adding their own content later on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kaylee. So now we're going to go over some of those Google Sites features that we talked about on the previous slide. So different things on the actual Google Sites page that students should be familiar with as they start assembling their ePortfolio. So just hopping over to the Google Sites. So here we're actually going to go through our sample and touch on these different features at the same time. So the first thing I want to point out here is this right side menu. So this is kind of going to be everything that students need to know in terms of really making their ePortfolio unique. So you see here we have this insert tab. This is going to be that central hub where students can go ahead and include either text boxes, images, embed things into their actual site, or if they want to access something housed in their Google Drive. So as I mentioned earlier, part of that process is going to be collecting all of the artifacts on the Google Drive. So simply by clicking on this, students can access anything shared in their Google Drive. So here it's pulling up my Google Drive with all of the different documents that I might be interested in including. So just heading back here to that menu again. Now the second part you see here is that layouts option. So I mentioned earlier that when students are creating the learning journal component of their ePortfolio, they have a couple of different options when it comes to how do they want it to look. You know, this is of course going to depend also on how many artifacts they choose to include. So you have some different options if they want to do that side by side, that on top image and the description to fall below it. If it's younger students and you're not having them write these lengthy reflections, you might want to do something like incorporating just the pictures. A couple of different options depending as you see here. Now some other things towards the bottom here that students might want to take advantage of is going to be some specifics I'm going to point out in order to make those ePortfolios interactive. So again, we don't want it to be this static site that no one can really engage with the material. So students might choose to do something like an image carousel, You'll see an example of this in a minute, where students can include multiple images of the same activity, and then whoever's viewing their ePortfolio can go ahead and scroll through the different images. You'll also see this on our example in a minute. This is the button. So this is going to be where you can embed those URLs and direct to another project that you have done that's maybe housed on a different program or on a different site. Some other things here, our YouTube integration. So some really great things in order to make that ePortfolio a little more interactive for whoever is viewing it. Now, to jump into our second section here, this is going to be really important as well. So our Pages tab is going to be where students can go ahead and add those different sections of their ePortfolio. So as you can see here, I've chose to leave that first page as the home page. Then I've also created some additional pages, as you can see below. So I have the reflections, so this is going to be that learning journal. I have some evidence of collaboration as well as some evidence of technology. So you'll also notice here that I have this little additional section. When I click on that, you'll notice that I've also created what Google Sites refers to as subpages. So these are each of those fall within that learning journal. So I have a reading learning journal, a writing learning journal, as well as a math learning journal. So this might look different depending on what you're requiring students to add to their ePortfolio or what exactly you want to show their growth with. And then finally, this last tab is also going to allow students to add some of that unique component to their ePortfolio. So students can choose different font styles, different color schemes, as well as some different text options, bolded text, underlined text, all different things to make it look a little more unique from student to student. So some really great stuff here. So now I want to go ahead and take a look at the example that I have created. So I'm just going to enter preview mode here and leave it on our home page. So some couple of things here to point out. I've gone ahead and adjusted this title to make it a Who Am I page. So think of this as an introduction. So you might want to ask students to come up with a little blurb that tells about who they are and what is the purpose of this portfolio. So as you can see here, I've wrote, I'm Emma and I'm a 4th grade student or 4th grader at RBK Elementary School in Miss K's class. I'm continuing to grow every day as a reader, a writer, a scientist, and an engineer. So now as I scroll down on the page, you can see I use that image carousel feature to incorporate some different Bitmojis here. So this is one example of an interactive component. Whoever's viewing my ePortfolio can go ahead and click on those different image carousels and all the different pictures up here. Now heading over to our top right corner, you're going to see those pages that I've included. So first thing we're going to take a closer look at is that reflections. So as I click on the reflections, those 3 subpages appear. Once again, my reading, my writing, and my math. And if I wanted to, I could add to this, add a social studies learning journal, a science learning journal, whatever it is I want to showcase that student understanding of. So clicking into our reading learning journal, here I have a couple of different things I want to point out. So I've chosen to add different sections. The first one is a description. So this would be something that the teacher writes. And here I have the teacher kind of explaining all of the different benchmarks that students in 4th grade are expected to achieve. So I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but as you can see here, I've underlined some things. So really taking advantage of those different features to make the text jump out, where I've included things like mentioning Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary words, that students are working on character motivation, understanding complicated plots. So some different things here that I want to make sure that whoever is viewing this portfolio understands, well, this is what I'm showing you through all this different student work. Now, if you take a look at this second section, this is the reflection, and this is going to be something that the students would write. So the students you may ask your students to reflect on how they've grown as a reader or a writer or something this year. So now as I scroll down, now you're going to see what I call the real bulk of the ePortfolio. This is that learning journal component. So I chose to do that side-by-side layout where I incorporated an image. So this particular image is a running record. I titled it with the accuracy and the words per minute. And then I had my student reflect on what this shows. So they wrote, I had a really hard time with this passage. I think it was because it was nonfiction. So not going to go through the whole thing, but it really requires that students take a look at their work, think back to that activity and what it tells them, what it reveals about them as a learner. So now if I jump on over to the writing learning journal, you're going to see very similar. This time in the reflection section, I actually incorporated some images of some anchor charts. So again, this is something that the student would write. And this particular student wrote, I feel like I've grown as a writer this year. These particular anchor charts really helped me so much as I was writing this year. I will always remember them as I move on to 5th grade. So just another form of a reflection. And then as I scroll down the page, again, more artifacts, choosing that same layout, that side by side. Now, when we speak about that interactive component, keep in mind that I did choose to do written reflections, but this could always be recorded and incorporated onto the ePortfolio as a video clip. And in order to do that, you'd simply go back into that edit mode and take advantage of that embed option. Insert the URL code. So if this is a Screencastify, or even have students record themselves and then embed it as a YouTube video. So some couple of different options there to include a video reflection instead of the written reflection. So I just want to hop back over one more time to that example site and show the other pages and how I structured them. So again, I kept that same layout where it was description, reflection, and then the artifacts, but again, incorporating some images to show collaboration. And finally, let's take a look at this last tab. So this is where I incorporated that buttons feature. So I actually included a screenshot of 2 projects that the student completed. And down here at the bottom, you'll see not only the reflection, but these are the buttons. So the student reflected on their technology skills by saying, of all the coding projects that we worked on this year, my holiday card designs were by far the most fun. I enjoyed playing around with my code on Scratch to make my holiday cards sing and dance. So now I can go ahead and click on that button, and it directs right to the holiday card project. And as you can see, this is a card that we actually showcased in another one of our courses here on the platform. So some really great stuff to redirect, keep that ePortfolio to be a little more interactive, but also showcase all the great things students are doing. Now, before we head back into our presentation, the last thing I want to point out is I've also included this in the resources below the course. So this is what is labeled as the Eportfolio Tracker. So this is just a way for students to create a digital table of contents and collect all of those different evidence samples that they're going to include in their ePortfolio. So I definitely suggest, if you want to have a way for students to stay organized in addition to the Google Drive, check this out. It's linked below in the Files and Links tab. So heading back into our presentation here, so we've taken a look at our ePortfolio. The last thing we have for today is going to be that additional Otis content and some resources that I've included below the video. So we have a couple of different courses that you can definitely check out on the platform that have to do with Google Sites. So one of them being our Google Workspace for Education, and also our Google Sites session within our Google Basics course track. So definitely check those out if you're new to Google Sites and you want a little bit more information and get a little more familiar with using Google Sites. We also have that files and links tab below the video, so definitely check that out. A bunch of great resources there that will help you as you're doing this digital e-portfolio creation with your students. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you found this helpful and you're ready to get those e-portfolios created and you're feeling a little more comfortable with using Google Sites to do so. I'd like to thank Kaylee in the chat for helping with all those great questions that we had, as well as Brian behind the camera. Be sure to do the quiz and the survey in order to receive credit for the course. And if you have any additional questions, you can always click on that Ask Otis button and a member of our team will get them answered for you. From all of us here at Tech, have a great rest of the week.